Welcome again to another totally different place. This time you may actually eventually be able to figure out where I'm at, but we'll see how many of you catch on to that later on. But let me say thank you for listening to me today. Watching me too, but for some of you, listening. How important is listening? Are you a good listener? Maybe I should ask someone else, someone close to you, a family member, a friend, a coworker, your boss. Would they say you're a good listener? Listening is a skill that we need to have and that we need to do well. If someone's giving you directions, you need to listen to those directions or you're going to get totally lost. Someone's telling you when you need to be somewhere at a certain time, you need to listen. We need to pay attention. We need to listen. Listening is one of the most important things that we do. And of course, we all know that in this world, listening is quite difficult because we have all of these distractions. As a matter of fact, when I was writing this sermon this week, and just as I wrote that line, my wife sent me a text message. So my phone starts making noises. And who do you think I was listening to at that time? My phone or to what God was saying to me? Yeah, I got back on track. Don't worry about it. But we have all of these noises, all of these distractions, all of these demands upon our time. And it makes it difficult to listen. A couple surveys I came across recently. One said that most college students check their social media at least every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes. Are they listening? Another survey said that people in the business world, on an average, deal with over 100 emails every day, either sending them or receiving them or reading them or whatever. We have all of these things that are distracting us, that are taking our attention away from what we should be listening to. And all of these things distract us from listening to God, too. And this is nothing new in our world today. We go back to our story for today from 1 Samuel, when God calls Samuel. And notice how chapter 3 of 1 Samuel begins. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. Not many people heard from God. And I got to thinking, whose fault was that? Did God stop talking to the people? Or did the people stop listening to God? Or maybe we can combine the two and God stopped talking because the people weren't listening. Even back then, there was no listening going on. No listening going on to God. So we're familiar with this story. God comes to Samuel one night and calls out his name, and Samuel, who had never talked to God before in this way, didn't recognize that it was God talking to him, and Samuel thinks it's Eli. So Samuel gets up and goes running into Eli's room and says, "Here I am, Eli, what do you want?" And Eli says, "Huh? I didn't call you. Go back to bed. You're having a dream." And this goes on a couple more times until Eli finally figures out what's going on. And Eli says, "You know, Samuel, I think maybe God's calling you. So the next time you hear this voice, you say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel goes back to bed, and sure enough, he hears the voice again, and he says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And then God and Samuel have this conversation. I don't know how much of a conversation it was, but God tells Samuel what God wants Samuel to do. Yeah, the most of us don't hear an audible voice from God very often. But quite often, God does speak to us. And I think as we look at this story, we can look at what Samuel did, how Samuel listened, and we can learn from Samuel as to how we can listen to God. There's four things that we can learn from Samuel. The first one is, notice what Samuel is doing when God comes and talks to him. Samuel is laying down, getting ready to go to sleep. Samuel's not laying down watching TV. He's not laying down texting with four different people at the same time. He's not laying down thinking about all the things that happened that day or what he has to do tomorrow or next week or anything like that. Samuel has totally removed any distractions from his mind and from his presence. He doesn't have anything going on that will distract him from listening to God. Samuel is totally tuned in to what God has to say. You know, if we want to listen to God, we need to get like Samuel did, quiet, at peace, without anything else going on around us. The next thing we can learn from Samuel is where Samuel was when God talked to him. Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God is. Now at that time, the people of Israel believed that God lived in the ark. That's where the presence of God was. That's the only place the presence of God was. Obviously, we've learned since then that God is everywhere. But Samuel was where God was. So have you ever had God talk to you? Do you ever go to a place where you feel God's presence? Maybe that's where you need to go, so God can talk to you. Go to a place where you know God is, where you know God's going to be available, where you've met with God before. Make sure you're in the right location. Make sure you're doing the right things. The third thing we need to learn from Samuel is what Samuel says when God talks to him. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And we may not think that's important, but look at this story. God came to Samuel 4 times and called Samuel's name 4 times. But only when Samuel says, your servant is listening, does God continue this conversation. You know, God's not going to talk to someone who's not listening. You ever been in a conversation like that? Where you're trying to talk to someone and the person's attention is somewhere else, or they're distracted, or they're doing something else? There's no need to continue that conversation because they're not listening. God knows that. If we're not listening, God's not going to talk. That's why it's very important what Samuel said. Your servant is listening. Let God know you're listening, you're paying attention. And finally, we need to consider what Samuel did after he had this conversation with God. We go down to the last verse of chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, and we read that the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up. Now, this wasn't just a one-night conversation. Samuel made the choice to be with God, and God made the choice to be with Samuel. And not only that, go on to the first verse of 1 Samuel chapter 4. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. Not only did Samuel listen to what God said, he obeyed God. God told him to go and talk to all the people, and that's what Samuel did. You know, I can have a conversation with this podium. I can tell this podium to do all kinds of things. I can tell it to go make me supper. I can go tell it to give me a glass of water. I can tell this podium to go out and mow the grass. Is it going to do any of that? No. So why waste my time talking to a podium if it's not going to obey what I tell it to do? And God is the same way. God is not going to talk to us if we don't obey him, if we don't do what God tells us to do. God is going to quit talking to us because we're about as responsive as this podium. Listening is important, especially when it comes to listening to God. And yes, we need to do like Samuel did. We need to remove these distractions from our life. Not totally, not completely, but when we are talking to God, we need to be focused on God. When we're talking to someone else, we need to focus on that person. Remove the distractions and go where God is. Yes, God is everywhere. But there are certain places where it's easier to meet with God than other places. Whether it's your favorite quiet place in your house or out underneath a tree or in a church building or wherever it is, go to where you know God is and you can focus on being with God there. And let God know that you are listening. Turn your attention to God. Tell him that, yes, Lord, your servant is listening. And finally, obey. Do what God tells you to do. Do like Samuel. Go out and tell people whatever God asks you to do, go do it. What's going to happen if we listen? What's the result of our listening to God? Lives are going to be changed. I guarantee you your life is going to be changed. I know my life has been changed because I listened to God. It might be unpleasant changes. It might be very rewarding changes. But yet things are not going to be the same if we listen to God. And not only is our life going to change, other people's lives are going to change too. Think of the people that you impact on a daily basis. And think of how you're going to impact them if you do what God tells you to do, if you say what God tells you to say. Many, many lives are going to be changed if we listen to God. And God is going to bless us. When we listen to him, he is going to bless us. He's going to bless our work because we are doing his work. You know, we look at Samuel and we see what a great blessing he was to so many people when he was serving God. And God said this, and God promised it, and God delivered on his promise. When he says about Samuel in 1 Samuel 3:19, he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. God blessed Samuel's work because Samuel listened to God. So do you hear God calling? How are you going to respond to God? You know, last week I had the choir sing for you, and I got a lot of positive feedback on that, so I've invited the choir back this week. So you're going to hear from the choir again soon. The song for this week is Here I Am, Lord. It talks about God calling in the night and how we respond.